From the outside, the hut looked calm, a single yellow glow out on a frozen lake, a small square of warmth in the middle of a storm. If anything went wrong out there, people would assume that it came from the ice. A crack, a collapse, the black water waiting below. Nobody would think that the danger was actually inside the hut. It's midnight somewhere, and tonight I have a story for you. Now, like all my stories, tonight's story is based on real events. Names and identifying details have been changed to respect the privacy of those who were involved in this tragic accident. Ethan had been thinking about this night all week long. It was Friday, it was the end of the week, and the work week was completely done. Ethan clocked off and he jumped into his truck that he'd pre-packed the night before, and he was headed to his favourite ice fishing hut to do some fishing and relax and wash the week away. Ethan pulled his truck up and he dragged his sled out of the back, loaded with everything that he needed for the night out on the ice. And by the time he dragged his sled to the edge of the lake, he noticed that the wind had picked up. Not violently, just consistent, cold enough to sting the skin that was exposed outside of the clothes that he was wearing. Now, Ethan knew that the weather was actually meant to pick up during the night, but he wasn't worried at all because his hut was well anchored down and he'd made it himself from timber, and it was quite well put together. It was designed to cut out the winter cold and survive even the harshest of blizzards. Each step away from the shoreline Ethan took felt like stepping deeper into a quieter world. The sounds of the town disappeared behind him. His worries of the work week started to melt away. This was Ethan's happy place. The lake itself started to open up, white, flat, icy, and completely empty. The hut was a dark shape off in the distance, a box sitting alone against the snow. And by the time he reached the hut, Ethan was actually freezing cold. He stepped inside and he shut the storm out behind him. Now, despite the storm outside and the icy floor beneath him, the hut was actually much warmer inside than what it was out. The hut shielded him from the wind. Ethan unpacked his sled and he turned on the butane heater that he'd brought with him. And while the hut warmed up, Ethan kneeled down to pull the plug out from the ice. Black water opened up beneath him, still and silent, and he set his fishing rods up and he sent his baits down into the hole. He cooked himself some dinner, steam rising into the tight space, and the smell of warm food replaced the scent and sharp feeling of the cold air that had flooded inside. He sat back on his narrow stretcher, he poured himself a drink, and he watched his rods. And this was just what Ethan had been looking forward to. Outside, the wind rattled the hut. Inside, the world had shrunk down to the size of this room. Now, as the night drew on, the storm actually worsened quite a lot. The temperature dropped dramatically. The walls creaked as the wind pressed against them. Ethan turned the heater up, not because anything felt wrong, but because he wanted to stay in front of the cold and keep the cold from finding its way inside. The hut, because of the small space, warmed up very quickly. The butane heater was doing a great job of keeping the hut warm, and for a moment it felt almost too warm. And while Ethan was sitting in the warm, he noticed that he had a dull pressure behind his eyes. The kind that you ignore without thinking about it. He rubbed his forehead, he blamed the long week that he'd had, the drink, the way the cold had worked its way into his bones when he walked across the lake towards the hut. But when the pressure didn't ease, he decided that he might need to grab some fresh air. The storm flooded the room for a moment as he opened up the door, and he noticed that the pain faded behind his eyes. The fresh air felt sharp and clean in his lungs, so he decided to close the door again. About 30 minutes later, the headache started to come back, but this time it was much stronger than it was before. Ethan shifted on the stretcher he'd set up to sleep in, trying to get himself comfortable. The room felt slow, like his body was moving through densely thick air. Outside, the storm howled. The lake was completely empty. There were no lights and there was no other people or huts nearby. Ethan felt so average and so unwell that he thought about making a dash for it back to his truck. But because the storm felt so intense now, Ethan knew that it would be dangerous to go outside for any extended period of time, let alone making it all the way back across the ice in the dark to his truck. So going back across the ice now felt completely impossible for Ethan, so he decided that he'd lay back down, watching the rods, telling himself he'd just rest for a minute or two. The heater continued to hum, the hut stayed warm, and the storm stayed outside, and time lost its edges. By morning, the wind had died completely down. The lake looked calm again, the hut sat alone on the ice just as it had the night before, and one of Ethan's friends, Mark, was set to join him the following morning. Like Ethan, Mark was really excited to spend some time fishing and unplugging himself from the hectic world that he lived in. Mark pulled up next to Ethan's truck and grabbed his fishing rods, he slung his backpack over his shoulder, and he headed out onto the ice, and he could see the hut from the shore. Now when Mark got to the hut, he opened the door and heat rolled out towards him in a wave. It was way too warm for the cold morning air. The smell of the hut hit him first, not foul, just thick and very stale. And the moment that Mark stepped inside, his head began to throb. A sudden pressure behind his eyes, a light dizziness that made the small room feel quite unsteady. He took another step, then he took another, and he noticed that Ethan was still laying down on the stretcher. Mark called his name, but there was no response from Ethan. Mark's headache started to worsen, his stomach started to turn, and he suddenly felt the urge to step back outside and into the cold. Now, instinct, more than thought, made Mark grab Ethan's arm and pull, dragging him towards the door, out towards the open air. Mark dragged Ethan out of the hut and into the snow. And the cold hit his lungs like a shock compared to the hot, dense and stale environment inside the shed. The headache that had been building for Mark inside the hut began to ease almost instantly. And that's when Mark realised that Ethan wasn't actually breathing. He shook him, he called his name again, but there was nothing. There was no response. Ethan was completely unresponsive. Now with numb fingers, Mark fumbled for his phone and he called for help. Emergency lights eventually cut across the frozen surface. Red and blue flashes reflecting off the snow. The lake that had felt empty an hour earlier suddenly filled with movement. Paramedics moved fast, but very sadly, there was nothing left to bring back. The heater that Ethan had used to keep warm had turned his small fishing space completely lethal. Slowly and quietly, it filled the hut with something that his body couldn't physically survive. Ethan hadn't fallen through the ice, the lake hadn't given way beneath him, the danger hadn't come from the storm outside. Very sadly, Ethan died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Until next time, I'll see you at midnight.